The fantasy playoffs are here, and there are 5 players who are pretty quickly rising up the fantasy rankings and becoming league winners. In my opinion, these are the 5 guys that you're going to need on your roster the next month to actually win your league, and it starts with Amari Cooper. Yes, the Bills wide receiver, somewhat new Bills wide receiver Amari Cooper, who for the most part this season, since joining the Buffalo Bills, he had that first game where he played like 12 snaps, scored a touchdown, it looked good. Since then, it's been bad. Amari has dealt with multiple things. Injuries, which kept him out until week 11, so that's an issue. He came back and he was limited. He only earned 8% of the targets. Then in week 13, he comes out here and he plays in a snow game. He finally gets his routes up 63%, sees 18% of the targets. But again, this was the snow game against the 49ers. They were running the ball nonstop. James Cook had a big play, right? There really wasn't much need for the passing attack given the conditions. And because of this, when you pull up the game logs on Player Profiler, since he joined the Bills right here, here's that 16.5 points on a limited role. Great. Since then, 1 point, 7 points, 4 points. Like everything has been really bad. Most people were ranking Amari Cooper outside their top 36 receivers for week 14, despite 6 teams being on bye, right? So all of this was bad, but we finally got to see it. We finally got to see it in week 14 for Amari Cooper. He comes out here, look at this, 14 targets, more than double any other player on the team. And those 14 targets were not only a season high for Amari Cooper, but also a season high for any Bills wide receiver this year. That's meaningful. That translated to a 38% target share. And this was a game where they were trailing pretty much the whole time, but still it was good to see that they relied on Amari Cooper for 14 targets, 6 catches, 95 yards, was targeted not only in the short parts of the field where he saw a lot of receptions, but also downfield, especially late in the game. He continued to get targeted downfield as the main priority option, usually 3-4 times in a row at certain points in the fourth quarter from Josh Allen. And here's the thing when you look at it, like the target competition remains the same. It's pretty much just Khalil Shakur as the main piece of target competition. Shakur had over 100 yards in this game, has had a nice season all year. Matt Collins is in there, right? He had a red zone touchdown in this game. We'll see what happens when Keon Coleman returns, but it's nice to see we finally got to see Amari Cooper, who for the most part this season, since he's joined the Buffalo Bills, has either been limited because he joined the new team, so he had to learn the playbook, limited because of a potential injury he was dealing with in his wrist, or bad weather. This past week was like the first week we actually got to see it all come together. And now he's shaping up to be a league winner, because look at this in week 15. Like you might say, oh, the Bills aren't going to trail in most games. Well, this week they're actually underdogs against the Detroit Lions, the potentially 2 best teams in football, a 54-point total in this one. There's going to be a lot of points. There's probably going to be a lot of passing for Buffalo. That's a nice spot against a banged up Lions secondary. You look at the rest of the season, they'll go up against a Patriots bottom 10 secondary. That's a nice spot as well. And then the Jets in the fantasy championship, a shaky defense as of late. We just saw Tua in week 14 drop over 330 passing yards and 2 touchdowns against them. So Amari Cooper, not just this week, definitely next week against the Lions, and moving forward into the fantasy playoffs is looking like a league winner. And so is this running back, maybe even more so this rookie running back, former wide receiver in college, the 5th rounder for the New York Giants, and that is Tyron Tracy, who, look, there is a little bit of a concern heading into that Thanksgiving game in week 13 because Tracy fumbled in week 10 and week 12. They had bye in week 11, so it was back-to-back games where he had fumbles. Now you can see that usage right here. In week 10, he was still the clear RB1, 79% of the snaps, 53% of the rush attempts. Week 12, he fumbles. He ends up getting benched later on in that game. He comes in garbage time for some checkdowns, but only 41% of the snaps, 45% of the rush attempts. So the question becomes, will he start to lose more work in week 13 to Devin Singletary? Well, we got that answer, and the answer was just pretty much no. And it makes sense because he's so dynamic, you can't keep him off the field. 71% of the snaps, 45% of the rush attempts. In week 13 on Thanksgiving Day against the Cowboys, he sees 11 total touches, puts up over 60 yards and a touchdown, gets back into the nice fantasy-friendly production box score with 14.5 points, and this usage continued. It continued into then week 14 this past week, where we got to see yet again Tyron Tracy take on the lion's share, let's talk now, of the touches. And here's what that looked like this past week. You can see right here, Tyron Tracy, 65 snaps to just 14 for Devin Singletary. Elite workhorse usage, arguably the best we've seen in a game with Devin Singletary active this year. 16 carries, just 2 for Singletary, an insane 9 targets, which was over 20% of the targets. Anytime you're touching 20% of the targets, that's rare air. Like, that's like league high rates at the running back position. It's elite usage. He saw that this past week for, again, the former wide receiver. And all of this strong usage basically came down to him earning 21 touches. He goes over 80 total yards in this game, finds the end zone. 10 targets for a running back is insane. We might continue to see that due to some poor quarterback play, needing to check the ball down a lot more, and shaky offensive line play. 19 fantasy points in a nice matchup against the Saints. We called that out as one of the best matchups of the week last week on this channel and some of our Yahoo work as well. It was nice to see it come through, and now moving forward, things are looking really good for the late round rookie who's averaging over 5 yards per touch, borderline top 10 in the NFL this year. year. If you look at the game logs, basically since he ended up taking over when Devin Singletary got hurt, look at this production. 14 points, 22. Okay, then a 6. That's a stinker. 23, 15, 9 in the game where he fumbles, 14 and a half, now 19. During this span, over the last 2 months, he's gotten you at least 12 fantasy points in 7 of his last 9 games. And it's pretty safe to say after this past week where he was playing well over 70% of the snaps and Singletary only saw 2 touches compared to 20 plus for Tracy, that this is now Tracy's backfield. So when we start to look forward a little bit here for the Giants, at home against the Ravens, that's a brutal matchup. But you know the one thing here, although it's a top 3 run defense, they do allow a lot of check down targets to running backs. Tracy's coming off of a 10 target game. He got activated in the receiving game, a former receiver. Earlier this season, we saw Chase Brown against the Ravens, a similar type of back in terms of they can get there in the receiving game. Chase Brown had a ton of receptions and got there as a pass catcher. And you look forward a little bit more against the Falcons. That's a middle of the road defense. Against the Colts at home, that's a nice matchup where they might actually be favorites in that game. At that point in the season, we'll have to see, but also a poor tackling team in the Colts. So rest of the season schedule looks good for Tyron Tracy. Usage, explosiveness, all looks good. Obviously, the offensive environment is bad, but Tracy looks like a league winner. Now, before we keep going into the next potential league winner, a guy who's skyrocketing up the rankings, I got to let you know about something exciting, and that's the sponsor of this video and our fantasy blueprint, Vivid Picks. Because if you love fantasy sports like I do or just enjoy making predictions, this app is for you. Because Vivid Picks makes it extremely easy to get in on the action. All you do is pick players, make your predictions, and then watch the games unfold. It is that simple. Now, personally, as I've said in the past, my favorite mode on Vivid Picks is the more or less. You simply choose more or less for receptions, receiving yards, rushing yards, whatever it might be. Now, here's an example of a slip that we took last week that ended up coming through for us. We took Jerry Jeudy's over receiving yards, Bo Nix under rushing yards. We turned this $20 entry into $60, and now you can take whatever plays you want for Thursday Night Football this week, the Sunday games, NBA, other sports, whatever it might be. And here's the thing. If you're brand new to Vivid Picks and you use the code SAL, they'll give you a free deposit bonus up to $250. So if you put in $25, you get $25 right back. You put in $250, you're a heavy hitter, a head honcho, you get $250 right back. So if you're ready to start making your predictions and taking advantage of that deposit bonus, download the Vivid Picks app now with code SAL and get ready to dominate. So a big thank you for Vivid Picks for sponsoring the Fantasy Blueprint and this video. Let's get back into it. And we get back into it with another potential league winner, James Conner, who, man, oh man, James Conner just continues to be somebody these past now 3 years with the Arizona Cardinals who is extremely underrated in fantasy. Because what has he been doing this year and really since he's joined this team? Just commanding huge workloads, actually staying relatively healthy this year, has not missed a game. He usually misses 4 games per year. Knock on wood, hasn't missed one this year. Between his carries of over 15 per game, targets of over 3 per game, this guy's averaging nearly 19 touches per game despite turning 30 in a couple of months. And when we look at the efficiency, still averaging 5 yards per touch, number 1 in juke rate, that is broken tackle rate, because he leads the NFL in broken tackles with 75 over 6 per game. So even when the offensive line, which is now playing better but wasn't playing as well to begin the year, he was creating on his own. And this has continued when you look at week 14, because James Conner, some past weeks he hasn't been playing well, whether that was coming out of the games or just blowouts. And you can see right here, got all the usage in a key game against the Seahawks for the division. 55 snaps compared to just 10 for Benson, 8 for DeMercado. You scroll over to the actual carries and touches, 18 carries, only 2 for the other running backs, 4 targets in this one. So 22 total opportunities. Here's what it led to for James Conner. Finally gets back into being a top 10 running back on the week. 22 touches, go for 122 total yards, a receiving touchdown in a very key game. They relied on Conner. And now when we look ahead to as soon as week 15, it's another great spot. He's a 6.5, 7 point favorite, depending on where you look, at home against the Patriots, who the Patriots are a solid tackling team, but overall, according to PFF, ranked 25th in run stop. And then we start to look at the rest of the schedule. He gets the Panthers in this fantasy semifinals. Even though it's on the road, the Panthers allowed the most rushing yards per game, the second most rushing touchdowns. They just gave up over 200 total yards to the Eagles, averaged over 6 yards per carry allowed to Kenneth Gainwell and Saquon Barkley. Then you get the Rams, who, as of right now, the Rams, Conner faced them earlier this year. He put up 124 total yards on 22 touches. The Rams are a bottom 10 tackling team as well. So everything looks good for Conner, trending in the right direction. Great fantasy postseason schedule, league winner. And another running back who kind of fits this criteria is Chuba Hubbard, because first off, this guy's been a stud all season long. And recently, when you look at some things right here, look at this workloads. I mean, 88% of the snaps with Jonathan Brooks back making his debut. 79% of the snaps in week 13. The concern that we had, though, in week 13 was just 57% of the rush attempts because Jonathan Brooks was actually back and looking better. But this past week, Jonathan Brooks left the game with a knee injury, and the usage for Chuba Hubbard was insane. It's already been good all year long. It hit season highs. Because in this game, as you can see right here on Fantasy Life, you got 97% of the snaps. Literally came off the field for just 1 snap in this game. 76% of the rush attempts, because of course the quarterbacks and the running and any wide receiver end arounds factor into that. But look at this. A whopping 30 touches between his carries and receptions, goes over 100 yards, finds the end zone, puts up 20 fantasy points. The most impressive part about this, outside of just seeing 30 touches, which is insane to begin with, he did it against the Eagles. The Eagles' #1 ranked defense this year, a top 5 defensive line in run stop, and he was still able, of course it took a lot of volume though, to produce 20 points for you. And he finished as a top 10 running back on the week, which made me just remember remember how good he's been this year. Let's scroll through it. How many top 10 finishes does Chuba Hubbard have this year? Here's a question you can bring to your friends. There's 1, there's 2, there's 3. That's 3 in a row at one point. There's 4, there's 5, and this past week was 6. So he has 6 top 10 finishes this year. Nearly 50% of his games he's finishing in the top 10. And now so far, in 9 of his last 11 games, he's had at least 100 total yards or a touchdown. He's one of only 4 running backs to do that. And you got this guy in like maybe the 14th round of your fantasy drafts, if not the waiver wires earlier this year. Everything looks good with his role. When we look at James Conner, it's a very similar role to what Chuba Hubbard's getting. Over 19 touches per game right now, top 12 in red zone usage. That's where you get a lot of upside in fantasy, hence all of his touchdowns. And Jonathan Brooks left this past week with a knee injury. He did not return to that game. People are saying and are concerned that this could be a re-tear to his ACL, which would just be so brutal for a guy who took a year to come back from this after tearing it last November. That's what Sports MD Analysis, a Harvard-trained surgeon, is saying right now. Video is concerning for an ACL re-tear and or a meniscus, likely an MRI on Monday. By the time you're watching this, I don't have the update on if it is that. By the time you're watching this, there's a chance that Brooks is going to at least miss next week, potentially the rest of the year, which means that any concerns we had around Chuba Hubbard's role of him maybe losing some carries are now gone, and he's going to get a great matchup next week. He's actually home as of right now as a 1-point favorite. The Panthers, rare favorites, maybe one of the only 2 times this year that they're actually favorites against the Cowboys, who rank 30th in run defense this year. The Cowboys who allow the 2nd most rushing yards per game. That matchup is good. You look at the rest of the matchups: at home against the Cardinals, beatable matchup; on the road against the Panthers, or on the road against the Bucks, bottom 10 defense. Yeah, everything right now looks fantastic for Chuba Hubbard. You're getting this great playoff schedule. Now going back to a full workload, coming off of a 97% of the snap, 30-touch game. He's a league winner. Next guy we got to talk about, we're going to go to the wide receiver position here, and it's Calvin Ridley, I mean, all year long, and really since DeAndre Hopkins got traded away back in week 8, has been a stud. And that usage, the stud usage, continued in week 14. As you can see right here, according to Fantasy Life, he ran 91% of the routes, saw a 38% target share, which tied a season high, and this led to a solid game. 13 fantasy points, catches 7 balls for 59 yards on 12 targets against Jacksonville, who allows the most receiving yards per game. You would have liked to see a little bit of a bigger day on 12 targets, ideally hit 100 yards, maybe find the end zone, but we'll take 13 points. And now, since DeAndre Hopkins left his team back in week 8, look at these target shares: 38%, 32, 39, 21, 26. You scroll down even more here, 16 and 38. He's earning a 30% target share since week 8. So that's the past 2 months of the season. A 30% target share ranks top 5 amongst wide receivers. So Calvin Ridley, yes, Calvin Ridley is top 5 in wide receiver usage the past 2 months. And there's really no reason why this should change, and it's not too shocking that he's earning this much volume with Hopkins gone, because his competition is a 30-year-old slot receiver in Tyler Boyd, who gets a couple of check down targets. Nick Westbrook, whose targets were up back in week 13, but for the most part is not really a target hog. A tight end in Chigakonku sees a target here and there. Maybe Tony Pollard out of the backfield sees a check down target. He had 4 catches this past week. But if we're really being serious here, the only guy in the wide receiver department and this entire offense who can command elite volume is Calvin Ridley. There is a little bit of a concern with Will Levis. He did injure his shoulder this past week. He was able to enter the game. He was throwing on the sidelines. He played through it with an injection, but it is something that is difficult to play through. It's a pain tolerance thing. There's a chance that he does miss week 15. If he does play, maybe he's limited or not as efficient. But even if he does miss this game, we saw Calvin Ridley for multiple weeks find success with Mason Rudolph earlier this year as well. And it's hard to say that you're going to sit Calvin Ridley if Will Levis is out. It's not like Will Levis is an elite quarterback. And this week, they're 6-point home underdogs against the Bengals. The Bengals are borderline bottom 10, probably bottom 5 secondary at this point. 6-point home underdogs usually leads to 35 to 40 pass attempt games, which if you're the number 1 receiver, you're probably seeing double-digit targets again. And the other reason why he's skyrocketing up the rankings outside of the volume in the week 15 matchup is the rest of season matchup. On the road against the Colts, bottom 10 secondary. Then he gets a matchup in the fantasy championship again against the Jaguars, who we just saw 12 targets against, who allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game, the 2nd most receiving touchdowns, most receiving yards as of right now. These are 3 strong matchups, 3 bottom 10 secondaries, top 10 wide receiver matchups to close out the season for a guy who's been earning a 30% target share the past 2 months. This is a league winner. This is a guy who continues to skyrocket up my rankings. And finally, we've been saying it all week long. We said he was a must start. He was a bounce back candidate of the week last week, and this is Jauan Jennings, because look, if you look at Jauan Jennings the past couple of weeks until week 14, a lot of people were getting frustrated with him, but none of it was his fault. Back in week 12 against the Packers, he had to go on the road in Green Bay where they just commanded the game with the run game. There was no Brock Purdy in this one, so it was a poor performance. 5 catches, 40 yards, but he led the team with 7 targets. Then you fast forward to week 13, and it's that game we talked about earlier. It was the snow game in Buffalo where really no passing offense could get going. And that's exactly what happened in this game, where Jauan Jennings had just 3 catches for 56 yards. You look at this on without any context and you go, that's a pretty crappy performance. But when you add in the context that, let's look at this. He had 56 yards in this game when Brock Purdy, if we scroll up during this game, only threw for 94 yards. So he literally had like nearly 75% of Brock Purdy's yards in this game. When you add in that context, you add in the snow game, it was actually a pretty interesting and maybe even impressive performance performance for Jennings when no other player on this team topped 20 receiving yards. Only 3 players on the team had more than 10 or more than 7 receiving yards, right? So Jauan Jennings, like, in my opinion, he was quietly like under the radar. People were getting upset with him. They were ranking him outside the top 24 wide receivers. Not the case entering week 14. Because in a good weather game with Brock Purdy back and healthy and under center, Jennings once again leads the team in targets. He sees 8 targets, running 25 routes. They really didn't have to play much at all in the fourth quarter in this one. Like, maybe the Bears made it a little bit competitive, but they weren't forced to throw most of the second half. And despite that, Jennings still put up nearly 30 fantasy points. He had 2 early touchdowns in the first half in this game, caught 7 of 8 targets for 90 yards. Everything looked good for Jauan Jennings. Had an explosive play of 30 plus yards, I believe, in the third quarter of this one. And now you look ahead moving forward against the Rams. On Thursday Night Football, they're at home against the Rams, who, let me remind you, remember what happened back in week 6 when Jauan Jennings faced the Rams and there was no, I believe, Deebo Samuel in that game, or maybe it was Brandon Ayuk was out. Jauan Jennings went out there and he had his breakout performance that put him on a lot of people's radars. 11 catches, 175 yards, 3 touchdowns on 12 targets. I'm not expecting this again. The Rams defense has gotten healthier since then, but the Rams defense also just gave up 6 touchdowns to Josh Allen, a season high performance for Amari Cooper, 100 plus yards to Khalil Shakur. So I think we're getting another big Jauan Jennings week this week, and also the rest of the season. A matchup against the Dolphins, their offense is playing well. That could be a spot where we have a potential shootout. A matchup against the Lions, obviously their offense is great. A potential shootout for the 49ers, who will likely be home underdogs in that game. Rest of the season looks like Brock Purdy throwing 35 plus times per game in matchups where Jauan Jennings will be the clear number 1. Deebo Samuel at this point is honestly a drop in most fantasy leagues. He has become absolutely useless, where Jauan Jennings has become the clear alpha number 1 receiver. He's skyrocketing up the rankings. So these are the players who are right now rising up my rankings as the fantasy playoffs approach, meaning to me, they're league winners. You have to have them on your rosters. Now, if you want to see the guys that you should be adding in your league before your friends do this week, check out this video right here. The waiver wire adds top 10 guys you need to know about. Get them before your friends do. Appreciate y'all a ton. See y'all in the next one.